So we begin now the Adam's book on the Vedanta Sutras, or the Vedanta Sutra. And so this is a text written by the author is Badarayana, who wrote this text essentially, as with all the sutra traditions, to systematize we've read the Upanishads now. Clearly, we can see from that there's no systematic theology or exposition or philosophy there. There are metaphoric verses, and in some places there seem to be monistic passages, and others monotheistic passages, as if there was a supreme being thinking and creating. We read a couple of verses, and then of course the Shvetashvatara, clearly strongly theistic, with Shiva as the supreme being. And then we had the other passages like the rivers merging into the ocean, which are monistic, don't give a sense that there's an individuality inherent in the Atman, nor that the absolute is personal. So we have these unsystematized, again, for a tradition, from a traditional point of view, they're divine revelation, so they can't be unsystematic. From an academic point of view, of course, they're human productions. They're written over the centuries, and naturally they're going to be, different authors are going to be writing, and that explains the apparent contradictions. Different authors over the centuries have different personal meditative experiences or different metaphysical frameworks, and therefore some are monists, some are monotheists, and so they express themselves according to their understanding and their experiences. Traditional thinker doesn't see things that way, because if they're divine revelation, then they must be perfect. So therefore, Badarayana comes along. He writes the Vedanta Sutra with the intention of systematizing and clarifying. In fact, there's a nice quote on page 9 of Adams. He's quoting Thibault, who's a great Indologist. Which sort of gives, I think, a nice, we could just read this and maybe unpack it a bit, a nice synopsis of what the project is of the Vedanta exegete. Okay, exegesis is how you interpret a passage of sacred text. Hermeneutics, we've had these words from Hamilton, is sort of the method that you use, consistent method to construe consistent, coherent meaning from a text, whereas exegesis overlaps with that. But often exegesis is used for solitary passage, interpreting a solitary passage, whereas hermeneutics is more your method for interpreting the entire text. So in Shankara's, there's the two-tiered reality, right? Some statements fit into conventional reality, other statements fit into ultimate reality, and that's how he accounts for the differences between the passages. But we'll get to that again. So let's just read Thibault right in the middle of page 9. So what is so therefore these sutras, the task is of taking a comprehensive view of the Vedic writing. It's got to be comprehensive, right? You've got to have an overarching structure, or it's called a Siddhanta, point of view, through which within which the entire Upanishads have to fit into a consistent framework. So the task of taking a comprehensive view of the Vedic writings as a whole, of systematizing what they present in an unsystematic form, in an unsystematical form. Upanishads do, you have to systematize them. Of showing the mutual coordination or subordination of single passages. You have to show the passages coordinate with each other, and if they don't, which one is primary, which one weighs more importance, and why, and which one is secondary. So that's what he means by coordination or subordination of single passages and sections, and of reconciling contradictions. Of course, in your mind, as the exegete, as a traditional thinker, there are no contradictions. So you would use the language of apparent contradictions, but nonetheless, the task is to systematize them. Okay, so Badarayana comes along with that intention, writes the Vedanta Sutra, 4 padas, just like the Yoga Sutra, 4 adhyayas, 4 chapters, just like the Yoga Sutras, and within which there are 4 padas. So there's 4 chapters, in each chapter there are 4 sections. And Adams discusses this on page 12. And, all right, so you've got 4 chapters. Each chapter has 4 sections, or pada, which is cognate with foot, like pedestal, pedestrian, pede, pada, Indo-European four padas, within which there's a number, within each pada, there's a number of adhikaranas, or topics. Right? Topics, we'll encounter them, and you'll get a better sense of what that means. There's a topic up for discussion. Right? What does this passage in the Upanishads refer to? And that would be a topic. Might be something like the golden person in the sun. Right? The Upanishads may speak about the golden person in the sun, so that becomes a topic. So in each pada, right? 4 chapters, each one has 4 padas. So within the padas there are these topics, adhikaranas. And the subject of that topic is a Vishaya Vakya. So that's the topical text. The Vishaya Vakya is the text inside the Upanishad that's being discussed. Okay, you don't have to know all of that. You need to know there are 4 chapters and 4 sections within each chapter, and within each section there are topics. That's simple enough. Okay, so let's just we'll follow Adams along. So Badarayana and the author of the Mimamsa Sutra seem to have been contemporaries because they refer to each other. He makes that point on page 8. Jaimini mentions Badarayana in the Jaimini and the Mimamsa Sutra that we'll be reading later in this semester. So that's by Jaimini. Okay, Jaimini writes the Mimamsa Sutras, also known as the Purva Mimamsa. The Purva Mimamsa, the earlier Mimamsa. The term Mimamsa means investigation into truth. Okay, so what we're calling the Mimamsa school is the Purva, the earlier. Vedanta has another name, Uttara Mimamsa. They keep the same word, Mimamsa. So one is Purva, one is Uttara. One is earlier, and one is later. So why? Because the Mimamsas that we're calling Mimamsas, the ritualists who are perpetuating the Vedic rituals, they're interested in the early portion of the Vedic corpus, the Vedas and the Brahmanas. And what we're going to be calling Vedanta, but are also known as the Uttara Mimamsa, the later Mimamsa, they're interested in the later portion, that's to say the Upanishads. So the Mimamsa Sutra, or the Uttara Mimamsa, is written by Jaimini. The Purva Mimamsa, beg your pardon, the earlier one is written by Jaimini, and the later one, the Uttara Mimamsa, is written by Badarayana. And they mention each other. So on page 8, you don't have to know this for your quizzes. I mean, hopefully you're intellectually interested. So Jaimini, Badarayana, Jaimini mentions Badarayana 5 times in at least 5 sutras. Badarayana refers to Jaimini in 10 sutras, and of course scholars quibble. They say, well, how do we know that these are the same Jaimini and the same Badarayana, the same, they are the same characters that wrote the sutras? Maybe there are some other Jaimini. Scholars do that kind of thing. There's no good reason to doubt that they are. They're not very common names, but so that's just a little bit of history about the sutras. They were probably written, we can see from Adams's discussion that there's dates vary from 5th century BCE, till the 2nd century. We could probably date them around the 3rd century BCE. Okay, so therefore these are the 2 texts. So we've introduced also the Uttara Mimamsa, which we're just going to call the Mimamsa Sutra, because the Purva Mimamsa, we're going to call the Mimamsa Sutra, the earlier one, and the Uttara Mimamsa, we're just going to call that Vedanta. It's just another name. The Vedanta Sutras, the Uttara Mimamsas, Badarayana refers to 8 teachers before him, on page 11. So so this is an ongoing tradition of exegesis of the Upanishads. He wasn't the first. But all of these texts we just know by their names. Badarayana refers to them. I'll read the names. You obviously don't have to know them, but just in case you want to have a sense of they'd be Brahmin names, and what a Brahmin name might sound like in over 2.5 millennia ago. So there's Atreya, there's Ashmaratya, there's Odulomi, who's also a character in the Upanishads. There's Karshnajini. There's Kashakritsna. There's Jaimini, which we just mentioned. He's mentioned too. There's Badari, and there is another Badarayana. So there is actually another Badarayana. So there was another one. These are mentioned in the sutras themselves. Okay, so and we don't know if they were actually. Well, Adam says, for all we know, they could have been his contemporaries. It seems a bit unlikely, but it's possible. Why not? Why couldn't they have been his contemporaries? So anyway, he mentions these other Vedanta commentators or thinkers. Okay, so we've discussed page 12. The sutras then is 555 sutras. Sutra is cognate with the English word so. So tra is just a suffix. Take that off, and the verb is su. And it means to sow. You can see this, the similarity between the words. So the meaning of a sutra spills over into the next. They connect, unlike the Upanishadic passages, which sometimes are all over the place. So, jump, subject matter may jump. I'm not saying they're totally inconsistent, but they're not as systematic. The sutras are very systematic. So the very word sutra, so, that which, one verse sows into the next, and we'll see what that means. The next verse clarifies or explains or continues on the discussion of the previous sutra. Okay, now there's a big problem with, he discusses this on page 30. Big problem with the sutras, they're absolutely minimalistic. The goal of a sutra is because they're all memorized. You have to memorize all these sutras. And before you memorize any sutras, you have to know Paninian grammar. You have to know the 4,000 sutras of the great grammarian, right? Because they're written in Sanskrit. So you have to know Sanskrit grammar to learn them. So if you're a little Brahmin boy, and you're taking part in, or brahmachari studying these texts, you have to do an enormous amount of memorization. First and foremost, Sanskrit grammar itself. So they kept minimalistic, very kind of succinct, and to the point that they're incomprehensible. But we have to say that. They're so succinct, and I think we've touched on this before. You can't just read a sutra. Gita is in shloka, in verse, much more extensive, and you can make sense of many verses of the Gita, but not the sutra. So you're dependent on commentaries, the commentaries of the sutra. Even though Badarayana presents himself as clarifying the Upanishads, actually he writes 555 sutras, which really are so succinct that they need to be unpacked by a teacher. And of course, these would always be taught by teachers. They're not meant for, you're not meant to, the sages who wrote this didn't envision that, New York City in the 21st century, you'd be going into an East-West bookstore and maybe buying, the Vedanta Sutras. They're meant to be, received, studied, and analyzed with a teacher. So, okay, sutras then, minimalistic, and there's even a verse, that a sutrakara, an author of a sutra, the author of the sutra, of any sutra, takes greater pleasure in saving one phoneme, one sound, one vowel sound, a phoneme, than in the birth of a child. That's obviously being rhetorical, but that's how important it is to be minimalistic in sutra writing, because you're preserving them and memorizing them. And the assumption is they're going to be unpacked. I think of them as, like when the astronauts go into space and they take their little, their capsules. They eat a capsule which has all of the nourishment of a full meal, but the body has to unpack all the ingredients are crammed into some kind of chemically composed form into the capsule, and then the body has to then sort of unpack it. That's how I think about a sutra. It needs to be unpacked. It's sort of minimalistic, and then its meaning needs to be brought forth. Anna makes a very interesting point on page 14 that, it's not just we read these texts, but they actually, remember the grammarians? The Sanskrit language is actually to be heard, and because it's sacred sound. So we're actually, by reading them, we're not attaining the same experience or purification of mind as the sound of the Sanskrit language in the form of the sutras. Because those sounds, remember, are just emanations from Brahman, of Om. And so by hearing the sounds, then we're sort of very close to the primordial Om. And therefore he makes this, they're meant to be heard. So the truth is not just a concept, sort of, recorded in a script, but it's actually a sound. Truth is, because ultimate reality is sonic in some ways, it's vibrational, and therefore the explanation of that in the form of philosophy should also be received in sound form, because the sounds of the Sanskrit phonemes and the grammar of Sanskrit are only one or two steps removed from primordial. They're very close to primordial Om, and therefore can lead the mind back to that source. So first problem with the or issue challenge, we won't call it a problem, we'll call it a challenge of sutra, is its absolute minimalism. Second, each of the 555 sutras, there may be clusters of them, 3 or 4 or several in a row, but they refer to we mentioned, a topical text. That topical text is not explicit. It's not given explicitly. There might be one word like asya, of it. Of what? Throughout the entire Upanishads, there's probably lots of asyas. So we have we're not told in the sutra what the actual topical text is in the Upanishad. It's up to the commentators to identify that. We have Shankara as the first commentator, so he's the first one that recorded. There may have been others, 8 teachers that Badarayana himself mentions. That's in the 3rd century. And then between Badarayana and Shankara's in the 8th to 9th century, that's a millennia, 1,000 years. So who knows how many teachers there were in that? Badarayana himself mentions 8. Who knows how many there were in the 1,000 years between him and the first commentator, Shankara? All of that is lost. Shankara mentions names as well. So Shankara is the first that we have, that we have preserved, and he's the first one to identify the topical texts. Now, not all commentators agree. Ramanuja often does agree, but not always. And Madhva often disagrees with what the actual topical text is. So that's the second problem of the sutra exegesis. Is number one, extreme succinctness. Number two, the topical text is not mentioned. And the third factor that Adams, anyway, identifies is, just the challenge of learning Sanskrit. Sanskrit's it's a very dense language, especially philosophical Sanskrit. Now, poetic Sanskrit's another thing. It's embellished and poetic and elaborate, and that's completely different, just like in English. Poetry is different from, writing a manual for computer programming. They might both be English, but they're completely different genres of English. So the sutra genre is actually closer to a technical computer manual than it is to, But when you read stories of Krishna or the Puranas, the story of the great deities, then that would be much more poetically embellished. So, but this kind of Sanskrit, philosophical, commentarial Sanskrit, extremely dense. Few verbs, words are strung together, and you have to know where to break them up. They're not separated. Often words are strung together. There may be 20, 30 words in all strung together with no break. So how do you know? You could break it in different places and get different words. And Madhva, for example, does that famously in the Tattvamasi verse. That you are that, right? The river's going to the ocean. He breaks it up a little differently. He comes up with Tattvamasi. You're not that. You are not that. Because he's a dualist, not a monist. He doesn't want the river merging into the sea. Suggests monism. It becomes one with the sea. But Madhva is going to oppose that, and he can do it grammatically. He can legitimately do it by breaking up, instead of having Tattvamasi, Sa Atma, that Atman, Tattvamasi, you are that Atman, you are that truth. He takes it as Sa Atma, Atattvamasi. You can do that. Sanskrit, the way the words go together, allow you to break it up. Sometimes there are options. He takes one option that ends up being translated as, or indicating that you're not that Brahman, you're a distinct individual. So that's another challenge. Where to break the words up. Okay, see, these are all exegetical challenges. They're challenges for anyone undergoing exegesis, right? Minimalism, don't know which topic is being referred to in Badarayana's sutras, and the Sanskrit is dense, and words are sort of necklaced together like a necklace, just sort of put together in a series. So chapter 2, then Adams then introduces us to some of the commentators. So now we have, so those were the problems of understanding Badarayana's sutras, and we need the commentators to tell us what, apart from anything else, what is the topical text. The commentaries, when they're written, they're understandable, they're extensive, they are systematic, completely comprehensible if you know even if you have a background in Indian philosophy, But now we're introduced to a third new problem, and that is the commentators disagree completely with each other. Not necessarily about which passage is being referred to, but in their overall interpretation of the Upanishads. We've already encountered this. For Shankara, any references to the Atman being an individual, any reference to the world, the world is illusory, the individual is illusory, there's only Brahman, everything else is a mirage. And so therefore those passages within the Upanishads speak of oneness, like the rivers going into the sea. He sees those are the higher passages. He calls Paramarthika. They're giving the ultimate truth. Well, what does he do with the other passages where it seems to be there's a God thinking and willing and creating a real world and individual souls? Well, he says, well, in those passages, the Upanishads are speaking from a conventional point of view. Like in the mirage. Within the mirage, it appears that there's an oasis and a lake and date tree and palm trees and what have you. But it's actually a mirage. But there's a logic internal to that mirage. There are things. Apparently, there are apparent things. So conventionally, appears to be. It's used the word conventional, vyavaharika. If you're in the mirage, if you're under that illusion, then you see. You see certain things. They appear real to you. So therefore, the passages in the Upanishads that speak of dualism and realism, the real world, and a personal God. Remember, you can't reject passages in the Upanishads. They're absolute. You have to make sense of all of them. They're divine revelation. You can't just say, oh, these are correct and those are wrong. You can't do that if you're a traditional Vedantin. So the dualistic, realistic passages and the ones that speak of God as a personal being, for Shankara then understands those to be speaking from a place of conventional reality. So we've had all of this. So Shankara then is the earliest commentator that survived. Remember, there's a whole 1200-year period after Badarayana. Definitely there would have been all kinds of Vedanta lineages, a lot of it oral. So that wouldn't have been, but we can also assume there would have been some text written that just never survived. So for him then, Brahman is just impersonal, it's pure intelligence. So you can go over Adam, go over again, and he doesn't even accept the distinction between a substance and a quality. It's an example of the blue lily. Normally we'd think of a lily as a substance, and the blue is a color that inhabits the lily. Could have been pink or some other quality. Shankara won't even allow a dualism, any kind of dualism. So therefore it's not that the Brahman has qualities. Why is this important? The blue lily gives us an example of a substance with a quality. Shankara is just going to say, no, it's just one entity that has, the form of a lily and the quality, the quality of form, lily form. That's a quality, and also, and not that they're two different qualities. It's just one quality of blue formness, something like that. So therefore, Brahman is not an entity which has the qualities of Satchit and Ananda, as it will be for the other Vedanta traditions, because then there'd be a substance with these qualities and more than one quality. Ramanuja is going to pick away at this. Is going to say no, there's differences in these qualities. But for Shankara, Brahman just it's one entity that consists of such what we might call it Satchit and Ananda, as if it were three different things. But really, this is just the very inherent nature of Brahman. Okay, so his intelligence, and so he has the notion of Maya. Maya is the illusion that causes us to perceive conventional reality. We see the mirage. We see a world of form and individuality, and we think we're individuals. That's because of Maya. And this, of course, is the Achilles heel of Shankara's system from the perspective of his later detractors, the other Vedantins. They're going to say, we've been through this. Where is Maya located? It can't be outside of Brahman. What's the relationship of Maya and Brahman? Brahman, by definition, is Satchit Ananda. It's pure, infinite consciousness. It can't be covered in any way. So where is Maya real? It must be real in some sort of way because we perceive the illusion, and we think we're individuals. So it must be real in some kind of way. So, later Advaitins are going to say it's neither real nor unreal. Of course, that's obviously not going to satisfy their opponents. It can't be both real and unreal. It's like saying something exists that doesn't exist. Which is what it's saying. So then the challenge, Ramanujan, he discusses this. What's the ontological status of Maya 21? What is it? Ontological mean what's its ultimate reality? What's its ultimate grounding, foundation? What is it ultimately? You can't say it's outside of Brahman because that was a dualism, and you can't say it covers the whole of Brahman because Brahman, by definition, is the opposite of Maya. It's pure consciousness, it's pure knowledge, it's pure intelligence. It's chit. And you can't say it's, part of Brahman is covered, and that part is the world that we see within it, with its individuals and its plurality of things. Can't say that either because then you've created a division within Brahman. Of course, Ramanuja is going to say that, but then he's not a non-dualist. So Advaita is the philosophy of Shankara, the great theologian. And even though the later Vedantins all disagreed with him, nonetheless, they had to take him very seriously. Ramanuja dedicates about a fifth of his huge commentary, right before he even starts, right in the first verse, 111. First Adhyaya, first Pada, and the first Adhikarana, just to practice those words. He dedicates the entire 100 pages of translation to refuting the Maha Purva Paksha. You need to know that word, Purva Paksha, opposing point of view. Purva Paksha. It's in Hamilton. If you look in the vocab list at the back, Purva, Purva, Paksha, Paksa, the Purva Paksha, the opposing point of view. So the Vedantins, they all have to engage the Purva Pakshas, and then they have to establish their own Siddhanta. That means your point of view, you being the author of the commentary. That is representing a school or a point of view, and that the world is real or it's not real, or this non-dualism, dualism, that's the school's point of view, and it's called a Siddhanta, the ultimate siddha, the ultimate sort of proposal, the ultimate philosophical perspective of that school. It's called a Siddhanta, Siddhanta. Okay, so there's the Purva Paksha. There may be many Purva Pakshas. In fact, the whole chapter 2 of the Vedanta Sutra Purva Pakshas. And I wish we could do that because really that's more philosophical. This is a course on Hindu philosophy, and chapter 2 is Vedanta debating the other schools, but there's just no, it would be so hard to fit that into an introduction. It would take us a whole month, to do that. And there's not really good translations that are user-friendly still. It's still early days for Indian philosophy in the West. So I'm hoping some of you will get your PhD, get inspired, and get your PhDs in Indian philosophy and become professors and produce material that we can use. I mean, stuff's coming out. It's definitely coming out. It's a lot more even in the 25 years that I've been, 30 years I've been in academia. Now there's a lot more available. But still, we don't have a good user-friendly. They're really technical. Of course, there are translation of the commentators, but they're hard. If you don't have a background in Indian philosophy, you won't make head or tail of them. So so it'd be nice to have at least some kind of a intro version of chapter 2 of the Vedanta Sutras engaging the other schools. But unfortunately we don't. Otherwise it would be perfect for a course like this. Okay? So Shankara then has this Maya is central to, again, he mentions some of the arguments against Shankara that we'll find Ramanuja. One is, how can you ever know a non-dual Brahman? How do you know it? Remember the 3 ways of knowing? I mean, Vedanta accepts 6, but we won't bother with the other 3. One is sense perception, but sense perception, through sense perception, we see a world of duality, of differences, right? The difference between a tree and a plant. And inference is based on difference. The difference between, I see smoke and I infer fire, well, there's a difference. The thing that I'm inferring is different from the thing I'm perceiving, so that's difference. And hearing, even, the Upanishads, well, words indicate differences. The subject, object, I, and verbs of action. For Shankara, there's no action. There's no world of action. There's only passive or infinite Brahman. So the words of the Upanishads require dualism. Language requires a subject, which is different from the object, and verbs, which are different from each other. And so we can never know a non-dual Brahman through the sources of knowledge. This is going to be one of the arguments that Ramanuja and later those who oppose Advaita, radical non-dualists, are going to say, even supposing there might be such a thing, how could you ever know it? How could you ever know about it? Therefore, it's unknown. It's unknowable. So we shouldn't even be talking about it. Of course, Shankara would say, that it can be experienced, and he'll have his responses to these, and that these that sometimes you have to work from within a mirage to get out of a mirage, right? You have to sort of you're in the mirage and you have to sort of work your way out. Or if someone has, let's say, mental issues, sometimes a solid psychologist might have to enter into that world, and someone thinks they're, Jesus Christ or something, and you can't just say, no, you're not, because that's not going to work. So you might say, okay, Jesus, so the therapist might have to enter into that world and slowly try to sort of convince the person that that world is false. So Shankara would have his way of dealing with this. He would say, yes, the words of the Upanishads just are kind of, they're like the therapist entering into our world of duality in order to sort of expose the unreality, ultimately, of the Vedanta itself. The Vedanta itself is part of the mirage. So anyway, it gets tricky for him, but the Advaita school has very strongly survived. It's very much a vigorous school in Advaita Vedanta. So they have all. Shankara didn't have to address his critics because they came after him, but subsequent members of his lineage then had to respond to these criticisms. And where is the ontological location of Maya, being one of the ones that surface most prominently, and so forth. Okay, so that's Shankara. Let's see if I've missed anything. So now moving along to Ramanuja, who is a century or two later. Let's get his precise dates: 1017 to 1127. So the tradition claims that he lived over 100 years, not impossible, 110 years. We have no reason to doubt that. Well, of course, scholars doubt everything, but there's no reason to doubt that, in my opinion, unless there's evidence requiring us to doubt it. In my opinion, tradition is innocent unless proven guilty. Unless there's strong reasons, why should we doubt tradition? On the other hand, we can't just accept everything blindly just because it's handed down, just because it's written in Sanskrit text. But I tend to err. I tend to be sort of sympathetic to the side, me personally, of tradition. Okay, so Shankara is Advaita, okay? No dualism at all. Dvaita is dualism, cognate with our English word dwa, dwandwa, and means is a negator. We've discussed this before, just like theist, atheist. You put in a word and it negates it. So in Sanskrit, because it's Indo-European. So therefore for Shankara, Advaita, no dualism whatsoever. Ramanuja's philosophy is called Vishishta Advaita, which sort of gets merged together. Remember I said words are sometimes merged together. It becomes Vishishta Advaita. It's actually two words there. He accepts the Advaita, non-dualism. In that way he sort of respects the to some extent, partly, he respects the non-dualism of some Upanishadic texts, but for Ramanuja, Vishishta, it's qualified. It's not absolute non-dualism. Everything is in one sort of way one entity, everything's Brahman, but within Brahman there are differences. There's differences between Brahman as the world, which is real, unlike Shankara, it's false mirage. Difference between Brahman as the world, the real world, and difference between Brahman as the soul, which is an individual, eternally individual, and infinitesimally small. Between those two aspects of Brahman and Brahman as the source and cause, and Brahman is ultimately a personal God for Ramanuja, Narayana, also known as Vishnu. Okay, so to explain that, he gives them the metaphor of the soul and the body, which Adams discusses. So the soul and the body, in one sort of way, you could think of them as one, right? They co-penetrate. The soul co-penetrates the body and supports and maintains the body. So in this metaphor, the soul is that which supports and enables the body. Okay, so it's only a metaphor. So therefore, the body in Ramanuja's ontology has two expressions: the world and the individual souls. So body can also be conscious. So the body has these two modalities: the world of real names and real forms, real pluralism. So it's realistic and pluralistic. And the souls are also pluralistic, and they're also real. And then there's God, who is like in the analogy of this body and the soul. God is the soul that supports and sustains and maintains the body. Body having these two different aspects. So now, how does Ramanuja deal with the conflicting statements of the Upanishads? Some which speak to the world as real, souls as individual, and and others, and God as impersonal, and others speaking of an impersonal, in a more an impersonal tone. Well, Shankara puts them into two tiers. Some statements deal with ultimate, real reality, paramarthika, and others just conventional reality of the mirage. And of course, as Adams points out, the Upanishads never say this. They never say there's a two-tier. The way to read the Upanishads is through this two-tiered lens. This is not something you put in the entirety of the Upanishads. Never does it say that. And his opponent's going to point that out. But Ramanuja's way of dealing with it is to say some statements are referring to the souls as individual, some to the world, and some to Narayana. So the impersonal statements are dealing with the world, or with the powers, which are impersonal, the powers of God. And this way he can relegate different kinds of statements in the Upanishads, rather than saying some are true and some are just conventionally true. Ramanuja says there's no what grounds do we have to impose that on the sacred text? The sacred text doesn't say that about itself. So he accepts them all as true, but just referring to different aspects of Brahman. So now that's his method. Remember, they all have the same project, the same challenge, if you will, which is to accept everything in the Upanishads as being absolutely true, but they have to find a way of making it true. For Shankara, the way he resolves this is to say, well, some are really ultimately true, some are only conventionally true. Ramanuja's way of resolving the different kinds of statements in the Upanishads is to say, well, some are referring to the Atman, some are referring to the world, some are referring to God, some are referring to God's powers. And when the texts talk about God as being nirguna, without qualities, what they mean is without material qualities. From Ramanuja, God is full of divine qualities, spiritual qualities, Brahman qualities. Okay, so therefore the metaphor that's Shankara has a two-tiered model. Ramanuja has this model of body, the soul and the body, and the other one is quality and substance. And we go back to the blue lily. Shankara is not going to accept any qualities and that somehow differ, and in a substance, suggesting two different sorts of things. He's just going to accept one Brahman, whose very nature is such and another. Not that these are three different qualities. Then you end up with, you break your non-dualism if you start saying there's three qualities. That's just the nature of Brahman. It's conscious. It just is. That's not a separate quality. It's just very nature is blissful consciousness. That's just one eternal, infinite thing or state or entity. So you can do that. Why can't you say something is eternal blissful consciousness? You don't have to posit, certainly in Shankara's point of view, you don't have to posit a substance that somehow has these qualities inhering in it. Not so Ramanuja. So he likes that. He'll say, yeah, the blue lily, just the relationship between the lily and the blueness. So is the relationship between God on the one hand, the world, and the soul. So you have the soul-body way of thinking about it. The metaphor of as the soul supports the body and enables it. Without the soul, body can do nothing. So without God, souls and the world can do nothing. And so that's one way. He has three different metaphors. Well, Adams talks about two. We'll just stick with those. And that's sharira sharirin, and the other one is dharma dharmin, quality and the thing that the quality resides in. Remember Nyaya, you have qualities residing in substances. So these are the metaphors he has. And therefore his Brahman is all one, it's Advaita, but Vishishta, there's these three differences in it. There's the difference between the Brahman as the world, Brahman as the soul, Brahman as the ultimate being. And he likes this, and so we get a quote here in Adams 24, which I think we may have read, I can't remember, in the Brihadaranyaka. Anyway, here it is, Upanishad. So Narayana pervades, the soul pervades the body. So Narayana pervades both the world, but also pervades the soul. So there's actually a super soul, an antaryamin, a paramatma, that somehow supports even our own individual Atman. It's sustained by God and pervaded by God in some sort of way. And all Vedantins have their favorite verses. In Shankara, they're called Mahavakyas. They're great verses that support your Siddhanta. Remember your Siddhanta? Your own point of view, the point of view of your school. So Shankara likes the Tattvamasi, the rivers merging into the ocean. You are that, because you are, Atman is Brahman. He likes that. He likes Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. Sarvam idam kalu Brahman. All this is Brahman. So these are the Mahavakyas, great statements. We did discuss them, right? We gave the example, I think, in Christianity. If you had to sort of apply the model of a Mahavakya, this is me making this up. If I had to identify a Mahavakya of Christianity, right, it's a short little phrase that kind of captures the spirit of a tradition. I would say something like turn the other cheek, or do unto others, or love thy neighbor, right? 3 or 4 words, and they really sort of, strike at the core of Christian, of Christian sort of belief. So Shankara has those, and Ramanuja has a couple of passages too. But he likes this passage in Upanishad. He who dwelling in all things, that's the Brahmanas, Narayanas, God, yet is other than all these things. Okay, he pervades it all, but it's other, like the sun. The sun pervades the universe with its light, but it's also a distinct entity in the sky. So it simultaneously pervades everything and is also distinct. It's a nice little metaphor, the sun and its light. So, yet is other than all things, whom all things do not know. Right? We don't know God. Well, we're trying. We might be trying to know God. We don't know God. Whose body is all things. So here, this is where he gets his metaphor of body and the one within the body. Who controls all things from within. He is your soul, the inner controller, the immortal. Right? He's not. You have your own soul, but there's soul beyond the soul, the Antaryamin, the one who goes within. Okay. So that's Ramanuja, and we expressed some. We'll read one more verse just to get a sense of the polemical nature of Vedanta. In other words, the later commentators are going to, they debate, not just debate other schools, they debate their own previous Vedanta commentators, and the later Vedantins, the Vaishnava Vedantins, are going to debate oppose Shankara. So so Adams quotes one little just to give us a flavor of this kind of the polemics on page 26, and I'll read it. If he were to realize, so Ramanuja is going to say, who wants to get a liberation where you're not an individual, you have no objects of awareness, you're just in a Sat Chit Ananda state. You say, okay, fine, there's some Ananda, there's bliss there, but Sat and Chit, it's just ongoing and consciousness. Who would be attracted to that liberation? That's not exactly philosophical criticism, but it's maybe an emotional one. So, but let's see what he says. It's in Adams. It's in your reading. If you were to realize the effect of such activity, right, hard yogic practice, knowledge, all this activity to get liberation. If you were to realize, meaning the practitioner, would be loss of personal existence, so you're no longer an individual. You just become like the drop of water in the ocean. He surely would turn away as soon as somebody began to tell him about release. Who wants that kind of a release? Moksha. He'd run away if he hears that, says Ramanuja. No one's going to start trying to encourage someone to seek liberation. And, okay, what's liberation? Oh, you lose your individuality and you just... the person might run away. So right? That's the way he's framing it. No sensible person exerts himself under the influence of the idea that after he himself has perished, there will remain some entity termed pure light, right? Because you perish as an individual, and then what do you become? You become one with Brahman, and he's calling it pure light. You're an infinite sort of luminous chit. So therefore, so that's obviously not a philosophical argument, but it's funny. But we did point out sort of some of the criticisms of Shankara. We're not favoring any of the commentators. So Ramanuja is going to get criticized, and actually is going to get criticized by fellow dualist Vaishnava, who also accepts Narayana. So they share a lot. Madhva, we'll see in a minute, is a radical dualist, and he's uncomfortable with Ramanuja's qualified non-dualism. Ramanuja is still keeping the Advaita, even though he's stuck a Vishishta in front of it. He's differentiated non-dualism, but there's still this non-dualism there, and later dualist Madhava is not happy with that, because if there is a non-dualism, then the imperfections of the world seem to somehow touch God. And Madhava's God is absolute, distinct, transcendent, pure, can never be affected by whatever's going on in the world. So he's not comfortable with this. He thinks that Ramanuja's dualism, or Vishishtadvaita, differentiated non-dualism, but there's still dualism in Ramanuja. The soul is eternally distinct from God, and the world is eternally distinct. So there are dualisms there, but he doesn't call it that. He calls it qualified non-dualism. So he's still working in a milieu, perhaps an intellectual Vedanta climate that's been very much affected by Shankara. So he's trying to introduce dualisms within an Advaita intellectual culture. So maybe he's treading more cautiously. But for Madhva, he's treading too cautiously, because by having any non-dualism at all, then it's going to start looking like God. Whatever's imperfections going on in the souls in the world, well, God is sustaining, pervading. He's touched by them with this notion of God pervading everything, in the way that, with the notion that the world are somehow the body that God pervades, and they're somehow also, because in Ramanuja, God is the material cause of the universe. And so therefore, in some way, if the matter is emanating from God, then the imperfections of matter, from Madhava's point of view, are affecting God. He's not having that. So he's going to have a much more radical non-dualism. But let's wait till we get to him. But I just wanted to point out that would be a criticism of Ramanuja, that his qualified non-dualism is, allows imperfection to somehow be connected to God. So then he has a quick section on Nimbarka, 11th century, very similar to Ramanuja, but you don't have to worry about Nimbarka for the quiz or anything. You just need to know about Ramanuja and Shankara, maybe a little bit about Madhva. We'll see if we put him on the quiz review sheet or not, but often we don't. We'll see. Anyway, the difference here with Nimbarka is a Krishna Bhakta. So Ramanuja is a Vishnu Bhakta. So for Ramanuja, Vishnu is the supreme, and Krishna is an incarnation. When Vishnu wants to enter in the world, he takes forms such as Rama and Krishna, and so Krishna is an incarnation of Vishnu. Nimbarka, no. Krishna is the supreme, and Vishnu is secondary to well, I'm not sure actually about Nimbarka. Certainly in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Vishnu is which is another school in the 16th century. Vishnu is an emanation from Krishna, not the other way around. I'm less familiar with Nimbarkas, and I believe it's very close to the Gaudiyas. So I believe that he says that too, that Krishna is supreme, Vishnu emanates from Krishna, but if that's wrong, then forgive me. I'll try to check up on that at some point. So, but much more of a Krishna, much more devotional, much more emotional devotion. Whereas Ramanuja is still sort of kind of more meditative, do your duties in the world, and his way of, he's definitely a devotee, he's definitely emphasizing devotion, but his type of devotion is more meditative and less emotional, more philosophical and meditative, Ramanuja's devotion. Whereas Nimbarka is Radha Krishna, and of course, I'm going to put a story on at the end of the last reading of the course, a Krishna Leela story, so you get a sense of this beautiful. We speak about God in sort of as creator and as a philosophical category, but what is God in real life Hinduism? It'll be Rama and Krishna, and my own personal favorite is, of course, Krishna and the stories of Krishna. So we'll include a story, so you get a sense of, of the Indian notion, just like Christians. They have Jesus, God takes flesh and becomes man in the form of Jesus of Nazareth, and there's a beautiful stories and teachings of Jesus. We'll have a look at one of the Krishna stories. And I'm going to change the syllabus a little bit, add that in the end, to the very end. Okay? So Nimbarka, he's also halfway between Ramanuja and Madhva. Right? They all oppose Shankara, radical non-dualist. Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita, qualified non-dualism, and Madhva is radical dualism. Nimbarka's in the middle. He stresses the difference in identity. Ramanuja stresses the difference in identity, that there's identity, but there's Vishishta, differences in it. Ramanuja wants to just shift that balance a bit, and he emphasizes more both the difference and the identity. So he emphasizes the difference more, not as much as Madhava, who's a hardcore dualist, hardcore differences, Veda, not as much as Madhava. So if we have a spectrum, we've got Shankara way over here, We have Ramanuja here, Madhva way over there. So Nimbarka is in between, nothing to do with Shankara, but, in between Ramanuja and Madhva, in between radical dualism and qualified non-dualism. So his philosophy is called, I can't remember if it's Veda or Dvaita. It doesn't matter, I mean the same thing, difference and non-difference. Because there's four, tradition says there's four main Vaishnava, theistic. Remember, Ramanuja is a theist, Narayana a monotheist, God is a person, Madhava is a monotheist, these are all monotheists. Nimbarka, the next one coming along, Vallabha, monotheist. So he sort of speaks about it's Beda, right? It's written right here. So Adams gives it to us. His name of his philosophy is Svabhavika Beda, difference and non-difference, not Ramanuja. I know these are nuances, and we don't have to. Don't worry about all this. Don't freak out. I just want to give you a sense of how the same Upanishads, the same Vedanta Sutra, is going to be interpreted very differently in different commentaries. That's the only point I'm trying to make, right? All you need to know for your quizzes is Shankara and Ramanuja, all right? And maybe Madhva. You don't need to know Nimbarka, and the next one we're going to discuss Vallabha. Why am I discussing them? Just to give you a sense of how you can interpret the same sutras and the same Upanishadic passages, stressing different things and emphasizing different things. So therefore, there's more of an equality between the difference and the non-difference in Nimbarka. With Ramanuja, there's more stress on the non-difference, but the difference within it. Shankara's way, only non-difference, only Advaita, no differences at all. So that's and again, his much more emotional bhakti. If the love of the gopis for Krishna, gopis are the cowherd ladies. When Krishna incarnates, they're his beloveds, and they have a relationship with Krishna, amorous relationship, and intense emotional love, and all of that, tears and ecstatic symptoms and all of this. Nothing to do with mundane love. This is love of God, but it takes very, very high emotional states in the Krishna tradition, and Nimbarka is more on that line of things, whereas Ramanuja is much more the stoic, Vishnu, more formal, more sort of calm, meditative, worship and devotion, but not of an emotional sort. Okay? Vallabha is like Nimbarka. He's a Radha Krishna person. Very interesting philosophy. His is called Shuddha Advaita, pure Advaita. Now you'd think, whoa, does that mean he's like Shankara? Not at all. He thinks Shankara has got a problem with this Maya. He says, you call yourself Advaita, but what's Maya then? Is it something else? And the problem we discussed. That's not pure Advaita. Because you don't know what to do with Maya. Is it in Brahman? Is it out of Brahman? Whatever you do with it, you've created a duality. So you're not a pure Advaitin, says Vallabha, 16th century. So he calls himself pure Advaita because everything is Satchidananda Brahman. But the souls are real and eternally individual, and the world is real. So what does he mean by Advaita? Well, he says everything is Satchidananda. And that Satchidananda, right, eternity, consciousness and bliss, is manifest in the personal form of Krishna. Krishna's condensed bliss. He has a form, beautiful form, lotus eyes, beautiful divine color blue, and all of his attributes are not material. They are condensed consciousness, we could say. So that's the full expression of Satchidananda. And then when the Ananta is covered, those are the souls, that's us. We have the Sat and the Chit. We're eternal and we're conscious, but we're trapped in the world of matter. So our bliss, we're not very blissful, right? We have our little Kodak moments, sitting on the beach in the sunset, or drinking, I don't know, whatever, having a good Ben and Jerry's. So we have our little flickering moments, but nothing compared to the bliss of Brahman. So therefore, what we are, when the Ananta aspect of everything is Satchidananda, everything is Brahman, everything is Krishna and his Shakti and his energy and his powers and his qualities. But when the Ananda aspect is covered, when we get the Jivas, the Atmas. And when both the Sat and the Chit is covered, when the intelligence is covered, then we get Matter. So Matter just is, it's Sat. It's eternal, it's ongoing, but it's not conscious. But actually, Vallabha is interesting because his philosophy indicates that actually Matter sort of is potentially conscious and blissful. It's just that that's been covered. And he has these terms of covering and then uncovering. So avirbhava and tirobhava, you don't have to know those, but they're on page 30. Very interesting philosophy. And so therefore when the souls turn to God and then God accepts them and grants his grace, then he removes then he reveals the ununder potential within us all, and then we become blissful lovers of God. It's a beautiful philosophy. Let me see if I missed any. And like Nimbarka is going to really stress the bhakti element. They don't reject knowledge or jnana, but jnana can only give you to the Atman. Jnana can take you to your own Atman. But only through bhakti can you get God. All of the Vaishnavas agree with this, although Ramanuja is going to stress jnana a lot more, certainly, than Nimbarka and Vallabha. So that's Vallabha, and then there's another school he doesn't represent here, which is the Gaudiya Vaishnava school, which I myself actually took initiation into the Gaudiya Vaishnava school. I'm a initiated member of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, which comes from, old Gaudiya means the east, comes from Bengal, sometimes known as Chaitanya Vaishnavism. And Chaitanya was a great charismatic. The tradition considers him an incarnation of God, just like Vallabha's tradition considers Vallabha an incarnation of God. And 16th century. So he has a Veda, like Nimbarka Veda, but he calls it inconceivable oneness and difference. So that philosophy is not in this introduction, so I won't mention anything about it. But it's another way of dealing with the problem of the one and the many, and the problem with the relationship between God and matter and God and the souls, and accounting for the apparent conflict or differences in the Upanishads. So these are 5 or 6 main schools. There's potentially lots of other ways of dealing with this, but we have if we count sort of Shankara, Ramanuja, Madhva, Nimbarka, there's Vishnu Swami, which to all intents and purposes is Vallabha, or Vallabha situates himself in that line. But anyway, Vishnu Swami, then we got Vallabha and Chaitanya. So that's 6 main traditions going between the 8th century and the 16th, and we have the newest one in the 19th century, the Swami Narayan tradition. And they've just completed their, 10 years ago or something, they completed a commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. That's another thing I should mention. If you want to be a Vedantin, if you want to establish a school, if you want to sort of, join the Vedanta club, so to speak, then if you're trying to found a lineage or a point of view, and you want that to survive, and you want that to, actually be a lineage, you have to write a commentary on Vedanta Sutra. There's 3 texts of the Vedanta tradition, the Upanishads, which create the problem in the first place, or create this sort of the need for systematization in the first place. Vedanta Sutra Badarayana is supposed to clarify it, but just they're so succinct and obscure that they're not clear at all. And then you have the commentaries. So if you want to, and their commentaries is where you get the different schools. And they all claim to be representing, of course, they should be clear about that. They all claim to be representing the Vedanta Sutras of Badarayana and the Upanishads. They're not saying this is an interpretation. They're saying this is what the Upanishads are saying. This is what the Vedanta is saying. There's no if about it in the minds of the lineage. And they disagree with the others to say, well, they're wrong. It's not like, oh, whatever, they're wrong. At least wherever they disagree with the school in question, the other school is wrong in that regard. So they may agree on some things. And they do. They agree on a lot. Actually, Ramanuja does often agree with Shankara's interpretation of Vedanta Sutra. But when he starts talking about, that the soul loses its individuality, or that, that Narayana is part of a mirage, oh, no. That's when you have to defend your school's Siddhanta point of view. Okay? So where are we? So now we've got to Madhva. We did Vallabha, and then Madhva, hardcore dualist. God is completely distinct. And he's not the material cause. Because if he's the material cause, then somehow he's sort of, he's in a way implicated with any evil or problems or that's going on in the world. If you're the material cause of something, then whatever goes on in that thing that manifests from you, you're connected to that. No, God must be pure and transcendent. So absolute Dvaita. And he has the 5 Vedas, the 5 differences between God and the world, between God and the souls, between the souls and the world, between one soul and another soul, and between one atom of matter and another atom of matter. He accepts a lot of Nyaya ontology, substance qualities, accepts that, but of course he adds a lot more, much more robust sense of Ishvara as a special soul. So he's Dvaita, right? So Advaita, Shankara one end, Dvaita, Madhava at the other end, and he opposes Shankara fiercely, just like Ramanuja does. So he's much closer, and they're all Vaishnavas, Ramanuja, Madhva, Nimbarka, Vallabha, but they disagree with each other on they agree with 90%. I mean, they honor each other, they revere each other. They have a bit of a problem with Shankara, but they also revere Shankara. They would say something like Shankara, was sent down in order to re-establish Vedanta, but he was working in a Buddhist milieu, so he had to tread carefully. I mean, they'll make up some story so that they can offer some honor of Shankara, but at the same time disagreeing with him completely. So they don't offer that to the Buddha, for example, because the Buddha does not accept the Vedanta texts. But they'll they respect and honor Shankara, they disagree completely. But Ramanuja, Nimbarka, Vallabha, Madhva, they're Vaishnavas. They believe in a personal God, that's Vishnu. Okay, Nimbarka says it's Krishna, so does Vallabha. But they all accept Krishna. The difference is whether Krishna is an incarnation of Vishnu, that's a Vaishnava, or the other way around. Krishna is the supreme and Vishnu is secondary. When God needs to create, Krishna manifests Vishnu to do the act of creation, because God doesn't create, because that's a job. If God had to create, he'd be bound. Then he'd be limited. He'd have a dharma like you and I do. So then he'd be a limited being. He has to do his job like everybody else. No. The Christian tradition says, no, wait a minute. God doesn't have a job. So that when there's a job to be done, he manifests Vishnu, and then Vishnu creates the universe. That's the Krishna position. So Nimbarka and Vallabha. And Madhva and Ramanuja, 2 earlier ones, for them, no, Vishnu is supreme, and then when he needs to incarnate in the world to establish Dharma, to do a job from their point of view, he incarnates as Krishna. So there's differences, but there are differences within the family. The highest regard is offered. They consider themselves a family, and they all oppose Shankara. They may give him some nominal respect, but they oppose him. That's part of their own identity. Part of certainly the training of these other lineages is they train to debate and refute Shankara. But their own identity as Vaishnavas is, we are not monists. We do not accept the merging of the soul and the loss of individuality. That's fundamental to a Vaishnava orientation. Okay? So much more of a hardcore dualist is our Madhva. So what does Madhva do when he runs into passages in the Upanishads that seem to be monistic? Adams gives us a couple examples on page 34. He might say some passages simply say that the soul is similar. Is similar to Brahman, right? So he's going to take liberties too, just like Shankara did. They will take their liberties in interpreting things to fit their point of view. Or he might say something like, well, that identity is like the identity of a king and the subjects. They're distinct, but, in some sort of way, they're humans, and they have there's some ways that they breathe, they eat, they sleep. They have some kind of ways of being identical. And once liberated, for all of these Vaishnavas, what is liberation? For Shankara, it's just you emerge in the ocean of infinite eternal bliss. Then for all infinity, there's no you anymore. So when I say you, I'm being, we're human. I'm trapped in the limitations of human language, because there's no you at that point. It's just this infinite. But you, the you that's in this body prior to liberation, when it attains Brahman, then it attains a state of infinity. No more rebirth, no more time, no more subject, object, no more nothing, no more action, no more objects of awareness. There's simply pure, eternal, infinite, undifferentiated, no little yous inside Brahman, no, just the one monistic you. That's liberation for Shankara. Not so for the Vaishnavas, because their soul is eternally individual, and God is eternally supreme individual. So what's liberation then? You go to the divine realm, God's kingdom, which is not in the made of property of the gunas or matter. It's a realm of pure consciousness within Brahman. So Brahman has realms of where there's form and quality, spiritual, and you have an eternal relationship with God. And it's blissful. And they would say millions of times more blissful than just whatever bliss is in the Atman. They accept that you can. They accept Shankara's moksha. They say, yes, you can actually attain a state, your own soul can actually attain, realize its potentially infinite state of bliss, of infinite Satchidananda, infinite, eternal consciousness and bliss. They accept that. But they say that the bhaktas don't want that. They reject that. They'd rather sort of be an individual, restrict that potential, that latent potential to be infinite. They don't want to be infinite. They want to have a personal relationship with a personal God who's also manifesting a form, infinite forms. It's not like there's one form of God for trillions and trillions of souls. Each soul can have their own interaction with their own form. And that bliss from that is far more satisfying than just being, in one's own nature, one's own in this Brahman, just being merged with no individuality in Brahman. So they would say the bliss of loving relationship with God exceeds any kind of mystical, monistic experience that is possible. They don't reject that possibility. So there's choices to be made, they would say. Be careful what you choose, what kind of path you take, because you'll end up with a liberation that corresponds to that path. And again, the Krishna traditions, that loving relationship with God in the liberated state is going to be far more emotional and ecstatic and fun. If you read the Krishna stories, they're so much fun. And the relationship with Vishnu is more majestic, but it's absolutely beatific and wondrous and fully satisfying. So there's no, obviously they consider their own liberation superior, or at least they wouldn't say superior, they might say more blissful, they might say something like that. But they acknowledge that this God is, Vishnu is God, and the majestic aspect of Vishnu is definitely an aspect of God, majestic. But in the Krishna tradition, God hides his majesty. It becomes playful little. It even becomes subservient to the devotee. So the devotee can be the mother of God or the friend of God. And we'll get a sense of that when we read the Krishna Leela stories. They're delightful, and I hope they steal your heart, as they have stolen mine. So we'll get a little glimpse at it. Right now we're doing philosophy, so we'll keep that, the more devotional thing, for the very last class, just so you get a real sense of real life Krishna Bhakti and Vishnu Bhakti. Okay, so that's all. That's the introduction to Adams, to the Vedanta tradition. Okay, so the Vedantins then are orthodox thinkers. They accept the Vedas. They accept the Vedanta. They are much less interested in the ritual portion of the Vedas, but they don't reject them. They just say that's for materialistic people. So the scriptures have something for everybody. If you're a materialist and you want the things, you think your body, mind, you're not really interested in liberation, you want the good things in this world and maybe a celestial realm in the next, then Vedic ritualism is for you. And if you do Vedic ritualism, you'll become purified, and eventually you come back and since once your mind is purified of desires, you'll have less desires, you'll have less need of the rituals, and then in a future birth you'll take up Vedanta. So they don't reject the Vedas. But the Vedantins believe that the higher truths, not this just material desires and going up to the celestial realm and coming back and doing it all over again, that just seems just absolutely tedious and full of suffering and not very smart, not a smart thing to do. So then the Vedanta, they accept as a revealed text. There are passages there about the Atman, so they all accept there's an Atman. All the Vedantins agree on that. The difference is whether the Vaishnavas, that in addition to our own Atman, there's a supreme Atman, there's God, eternally. For Shankara, God, all this talk of God and supreme Atman and individual Atman and devotion, he accepts it in the conventional level. So if you go to a Shankara ashram even today, they do puja, they do devotion, they chant hymns to Narayana, they do all of the stuff that the Vaishnavas do. But for them, they're just doing it to purify their mind so that one day they'll be able to perceive. All this will dissolve, and they'll only see the infinite, eternal, all-pervading Brahman, of which but there won't be they at that point, because they'll be part of that, so there won't be a sense of I. Then that will be the ultimate experience. Shankara. The Vaishnavas, no. Souls are eternally individual. World is real. We don't belong here, but it's real. It's not a mirage. It's temporary. The forms are not permanent, but not in the sense of being a mirage. They're just ever changing. So that would be, so that's and then the goal then is a loving relationship with God, either in a sort of contemplative, formal, God as Majesty of Narayana sort of way, or in a very intimate, sweet, playful way with Krishna. And there's many other forms of Vishnu that other Vaishnava traditions might stress. So I think I'll stop here, and then the next lecture we'll actually start with the Brahma Sutras.